Hey, Stephanie, it's so nice to have this time to interview with you. I'm super excited about the opportunity. Today, I have Stephanie Seneff, who is a senior research scientist at MIT, where she's had continuous affiliation for more than 5 decades. After receiving 4 degrees from MIT, she has conducted research in packet switch networks, computational modeling of the human auditory system, natural language processing, spoken dialogue systems, and second language learning. Wow. Currently a senior research scientist, which happens to be MIT's highest research rank, and at the Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory. She has supervised 21 master's and 14 PhD students. For over a decade, since 2008, she has directed her attention towards the role of nutrition and environmental toxicants on human disease, with a special emphasis on the herbicide glyphosate and the mineral sulfur. Are you looking for answers, searching for natural ways to support your body, or frustrated with mainstream solutions? So are we. Welcome to the Renewed Hope Wellness Podcast, where we're on a search for answers. We're going off the beaten path and diving into natural solutions to health and wellness issues. Our goal, empower you to be your own health advocate. So let's get started. Wow, that's a lot of life to read off, Stephanie. So a lot of criteria there that you've met throughout the years. What do you like to do when you're not changing the world before we get into research too much? Do you have some things that you divert?
Well, I love to walk on the beach and I love to be outdoors in the sunlight and I love to work puzzles, like killer Sudoku puzzles, for example, and fancy jigsaw puzzles. So I love puzzles and that's part of why biology attracts me so much. It's sort of the mother of all puzzles. It's a really challenging puzzle.
Absolutely. And I was talking to you off air that I actually had first became a little bit familiar with your research based on an interview that I heard. I think you were on a YouTube interview, and I was researching about glyphosate because of my husband's leukemia diagnosis. We had a lot of health stuff going on with him, but one of the things that shocked us was doing a panel for glyphosate toxicity and finding that when we met with the doctor, she said his levels are really beyond the measurable range. So she assumed he was a commercial farmer. And so as we sat there and talked, she said, well, clearly you spray Roundup every day. And she starts a dialogue. And we were like, we have never sprayed Roundup in our life. And also beyond that, we were very conscious growing our own food as much as we could, milking our own cows. We had dairy goats, chickens, like we were pretty serious about health. And so we began a search as to what is glyphosate and how is this connected to leukemia. And so it became a big part of our story where we found the connections to the toxicity of glyphosate and how there isn't a safe range, and yet we're told a lot of things. So that was my introduction to you, as part of a quest to help my husband. And since that time, I've learned a lot, but not even the tip of an iceberg to what what you can share. So
did you figure out where the glyphosate came from?
So I think it was cumulative from many things. We have 7 children, so eating organically, outside of what we could grow and produce was not economically feasible at the time. So we had done like good quality foods that were non-GMO even, or just trying to be a step above. But I actually had been milling my own flour from like ancient grains for years prior to this. And I had talked with a chemist at one of the places that the production sites that we had gotten our grain from years before that. And I said, we're getting a certified chemical-free grain, and we were eating a lot of grain at that time. A lot's changed since then, still having it, but differently. And I said to him, what is the difference in organic and certified chemical-free? Like, help me understand the price difference and why I would do that. And his explanation to me was that they are tested 99.9% residue free if it's chemical free. And in my mind, that didn't compute to 1 grain of 1 kernel of wheat compared to the quarter cup that you might eat, of course, over time. And so organic, of course, not being able to be sprayed with Roundup was kind of like that was that other price range. And so I accepted his explanation kind of ignorantly. And I think that was a big part. And not to mention, we were eating, beef from the store and things where, of course, this is storing in animals. So we changed a lot of things that we could and understood that he had a methylation issue with genetics. He does have MTHFR. So there were other factors that I think caused the accumulation to just be such a big deal for him. But it was an eye-opening experience. We came home from the hospital and realized that the week we came home, they had sprayed the mountain above our home and our spring, so our artesian well water source.
I was wondering whether there was a water problem.
Yeah, was at the base of that mountain, and it had never occurred to me that, and I was so angry. There was a whole dramatic deal over that. So contacted the electric company, which I requested the full chemical profile of what they had sprayed and how it was supposed to dissipate in water. And I had that whole lecture. And then I got literally, it looked like like an encyclopedia of a chemical profile that they spray. And it was terrifying. And so we had to then get a filtration system, and we left that property shortly after. But anyway, that's how I came to have a tiny understanding of the toxicity of glyphosate and how is this happening in our country. So that's my spiel, Stephanie. So I'm gonna let you lead on that now. So.
Yeah, well, so my story, I guess I'll give you briefly, which is you already summarized about my work before 2007, 2008. And that was when I really switched gears and started looking at human health and disease, correlating it with toxic exposures. I was interested in autism in particular, and I was noticing the rates of autism going up year by year, and the government excusing it as just diagnosing it more. And it made me very worried because I had never known anybody with autism as a child. And I just thought there's something going on here. And I wanted to find out what it was. And so I took 5 years of searching and looking at a number of different chemicals and coming up short. I learned a lot about autism at that point because I read everything I could about the disease and its characteristics. And then I happened to be at a conference in 2012 where Professor Don Huber gave a 2-hour presentation on glyphosate. And that was the first that I knew the word, the first that I was exposed to the word glyphosate. And I was blown away. That lecture was so important in my life because it completely changed my research directions for the next 10, 15 years. And I just was like, wow, this is it. I was so sure from that lecture, from that one lecture, mostly because he was talking about the things that he knew glyphosate was doing, messing up the gut microbiome, messing up the minerals, causing deficiencies in certain critical liver enzymes that detoxify other toxic exposures. And so there were just enough things there that would cause gut dysbiosis and issues of gut digestion and whatnot that you were seeing in autism. It just, it felt too perfect not to be right. And I hadn't even considered glyphosate before that because the government says it's perfectly safe, and I didn't think it could possibly be the reason. That's, you sort of just, and that's what most people do. They're like, it can't be glyphosate because it's safe. I think it is glyphosate. I still think it is glyphosate. And I have to hold up my book here, Toxic Legacy.
Yes, absolutely.
How the weed killer glyphosate is destroying our health and the environment. I was really very excited once I got back and started reading about glyphosate and hooking up with Anthony Sampson. And we wrote a number of papers together, as well as with other researchers. I'm still writing papers on glyphosate. And so it's an amazing chemical and has extremely unusual properties that make it far more toxic than we believe. My feeling is that it has a biological mechanism that's unique to glyphosate. And that explains why it's causing so many diseases. And so I write about that in my book, but I think it is actually getting into proteins by mistake in place of the coding amino acid glycine. It is a glycine molecule. It's an amino acid analog of glycine. It has extra stuff stuck onto its nitrogen atom. And that makes all the difference because it behaves very differently from glycine, but it goes into proteins, I believe, in place of glycine. And certain proteins have critical glycine residues that if they're not glycine, that protein's in trouble. And so it disrupts the function of many, many proteins throughout the body. And it accumulates in those proteins as well. It accumulates in collagen, for example, because collagen has lots and lots of glycine. And that's causing disruption of the properties of collagen, which is causing in turn a lot of joint pain, issues with back pain and knee surgery and all these kinds of things that we're seeing with the collagen matrix being messed up because of the glyphosate bullets that are scattered throughout the collagen, I suspect. And so this was very, very interesting science to me. And I think it's true, but it's still the case that the industry is denying that it's possible. So there's a certain controversy around that topic. But if it does substitute for glycine, that can explain why it can be causal in so many diseases. And there's a huge list of diseases, not just autism, that are going up dramatically over time, perfectly in step with the dramatic rise in the use of glyphosate on core crops. So there's a perfect match there with incredibly statistically significant correlations. That's one of the things that I did over the many years, is to look at all these diseases and rummaging through databases, that government produced databases, looking for trends and finding diseases that are going up over time, and then looking at the correlation and finding stunning correlations with glyphosate. So I think it's the primary cause of not just autism, but a number of different epidemics and different problems like metabolic issues like diabetes and obesity, fatty liver disease, kidney failure, all kinds of different conditions, Alzheimer's, ADHD. There's just a huge list, and some cancers too, like pancreatic cancer, as you said, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, thyroid cancer. These are all conditions that are going up dramatically over time. And it infuriates me that people say correlation does not mean causation, and yet they don't seem to be bothered by the fact that all these diseases are going up. It's like, oh yeah, diseases just go up. What's the big deal here? But that's not normal. It's not normal.
Especially when
we need to fix it.
Yeah. Yeah. Amen. Especially when it's concentrated in a 100-year span, or, it's like, wait a minute, that's not logical. But how do you think the glycine interruption, so would it be that it could almost replace or sit on a receptor for in your under?
Yes, exactly. Glycine is a neurotransmitter, and glyphosate goes in there and binds as if it's glycine. And that totally messes up the signaling,
Yeah. That's so when glyphosate was originally invented, I know it had some different history there, but it seemed to be on the principle that that plants had a shikimate pathway that humans do not have. So can you explain a little bit to the audience of what is that pathway, and how is that so revolutionarily different than what they said, that this is safe for humans because of that?
Right. I mean, that's the argument. It sounds pretty good because we actually don't have the shikimate pathway at all, the entire pathway. And there's a specific enzyme in that pathway that they've targeted that glyphosate has been shown to suppress. And that enzyme is called EPSP synthase. And since our cells don't have the enzyme, don't have the pathway, that's like, yay, this is a perfect chemical because it's not going to affect us, which is a great story. And a big problem with that story is that our gut microbes have the pathway, use the pathway to produce products that are essential to the host. And so that's a huge problem. When the gut microbes get exposed to glyphosate, they can't make the products of the shikimate pathway in adequate amounts, and they become deficient. And so these are the aromatic amino acids, which are tryptophan, tyrosine, and phenylalanine. Those are 3 of the coding amino acids of the 20 coding amino acids that go into all the proteins. They're super important for the host. We can get them from our food as well, but of course our food is also being suppressed in our food sources if they're exposed to glyphosate. So we end up with deficiencies in those critical amino acids. And they're not only coding amino acids, they're also precursors to a lot of really important biologically active molecules. In fact, all the hormones, not all the hormones, but the thyroid hormone, melatonin, serotonin, dopamine, epinephrine, all of them, and also melanin, the skin tanning agent, they all come out of that shikimate pathway. So when you don't have enough of those precursors, all those other neurotransmitters and hormones become deficient.
Wow. That, you know, the tryptophan expression alone, just the connection to serotonin, and you wonder how is this really cumulatively affecting, if I can talk, depression and anxiety, because you have
Right, exactly.
neurotransmitter disruption. So it's, you know, I think a lot of times being in nutritional work, I talk to people a lot about that, you know, I don't believe that gluten and dairy are innately evil in our body.
Right.
I think that there has been a change in the hybridization of grain allowed for a GMO crop that has now it's not even molecularly similar in so many ways to the gluten protein that we were eating, say, 50, 100 years ago, probably further back. But I always say I don't think you have a gluten intolerance and a dairy intolerance for a lot of people. It's a glyphosate intolerance. Would you
Right,
say that?
exactly.
Do
I
you
totally
feel?
agree. In fact, I've
Yeah.
written papers on that. Yes, about Anthony and I did a whole paper on gluten intolerance, and we showed that glyphosate usage on wheat, it matches very well with the increase in celiac disease. There's a good match there. It matches better with wheat than it does with corn and soy. You know, the usage of glyphosate on wheat. And I actually think I understand the mechanism, which has to do with gluten and casein. They're both proteins that have a lot of proline. Proline is an amino acid, and they have a lot of proline in them. Proline is a unique amino acid that is difficult to break apart from the other amino acids. It requires special enzymes. And those special enzymes are produced by lactobacillus. So the lactobacillus provide enzymes to the host that help the host to break down gluten casein. And the lactobacillus are very sensitive to glyphosate. That's
Yeah.
so they become deficient. They can't make enough of these enzymes that allow you to break down these proteins. And then you end up with these short peptides that can't be broken down that stick around. And then also glyphosate sets up a leaky gut barrier. So those short peptides escape into the circulation. And then the immune cells get upset and they produce antibodies to those peptides. And then those antibodies attack the thyroid through molecular mimicry. So the whole process is clear to me. And we have so many food allergies these days. That's another thing. The food allergies are going through the roof. So many of the kids, can't eat all these different foods. Peanut allergy, they can die if they eat a peanut. I mean, it's really scary. I can't imagine having a child with an allergy like that and being every day afraid he's going to get exposed to a peanut. That
Yeah.
must be very stressful.
Well,
And I
and
think that again is due to glyphosate
right.
disrupting the ability to process the proteins.
Yeah, and just the fact that the chelating of minerals, I was shocked when I came across some research that copper, just copper alone, was
Mhm.
actually, and you correct me if I'm wrong, Stephanie, that it was chelated 1 billion times faster with glyphosate introduction than it would have just naturally been in the cell. That blew my mind when you
Yeah.
understand the significance of copper in the innate immune system. So I'm like,
Yes, you're
how can
right.
we even wrap our mind around something that can pull out a mineral that we only need in our entire body enough as on the head of a pin? But the
Right,
power that
exactly.
that packs is amazing. And how I think we are chasing food allergies at a rate that no one has ever seen before, and histamine intolerance in general. I mean,
Exactly. Yes. That's
it
another one. In fact, histaminase is an enzyme. In my book, I define something called a glyphosate susceptibility motif, which is a characteristic feature of certain proteins that have at least one highly conserved glycine at a site where they bind phosphates. Very specific. In my book, I go into that. And histaminase has a fantastic glyphosate susceptibility motif that has 5 glycines in it. Out of about maybe 10 amino acids, it's like 5 glycines at the place where it binds phosphate. And so that makes it very sensitive, I think, to glyphosate. And I suspect that glyphosate is suppressing that enzyme, which causes histamines to build up because they don't get metabolized. And then you get histamine intolerance.
and leading to mast cell activation syndrome, and
Right.
and it's just getting to where I feel like we have attacked ourselves as hosts to the point that all these pathogens, very much in my understanding, what happens to a plant in the spraying of this herbicide is that it actually chelates and pulls out and breaks down the mineral level, so pathogens are then able to come in, and of course having much more impact on those really dangerous pathogens. And I think that I believe it's happening the same way in us as humans. It's just we're larger. I
You're
think
right.
it takes
Yes.
longer. Is that an ignorant approach on that, Stephanie, as
That's
far as
completely right.
preparedness?
Yeah, the gut microbiome is so fascinating. And there's been so many studies lately, you can't keep up with them. You get these papers with these beautiful charts and all these colors, and your eyes glaze over because it's so complicated and everybody's microbiome is different. So it's
Yeah.
very hard to kind of tease out the information and all that mess. But they are making progress. And one of the things that I've noticed and I've been writing about lately is butyrate, because butyrate is a really important short chain fatty acid that's produced by the gut microbes. And the colonocytes love butyrate. It's their favorite food. And so, but the microbes that make the butyrate are acid loving. They like an acidic pH. And glyphosate, because it messes up those proteins and they don't get digested, then the undigested proteins get into the colon, which they're not supposed to, because you're supposed to break them apart before the colon and then they get absorbed at the midgut, so the upper intestine.
Right.
That's where the amino acids get absorbed and then they can be turned into new proteins. So we basically, we eat protein, we break it down into individual amino acids, we absorb them into the blood, and then we use them to make new proteins. But what happens is that there's these peptides that don't get digested, as I said earlier. And then their sequences of maybe 6 or 7 amino acids type of thing stuck together, right? And they go into the colon. And then in the colon, they get broken down by these microbes, fancy microbes in the colon that can break them apart and fully metabolize them because they can no longer be absorbed. They get fully metabolized and turned into carbon dioxide and water. But what's left over is nitrogen, which becomes ammonia. So when you use protein as an energy source, you get ammonia, and ammonia has it's very basic. So it raises the pH. It's alkaline. And so the pH of the gut goes up, and then those acid-loving bacteria don't thrive, and then you don't get enough butyrate, and then the colonocytes get sick. So that's part of the process, I think.
Yeah, and a lot of the things we would use to try to support, as far as like greens and other things for certain microbes in the gut, where we're faced with something that's totally dismantling the good effects of that. I think that I had researched and they had stopped actually recording the amounts of glyphosate that's being sprayed in the U.S. Is that something that's still going on as far as whose accountability are we looking at here if we're trying to assess how much of this stuff is being sprayed and at what level are we now exposed, even if we eat organically and we try to do the best we can. I did look at some research that said there was a 75% of rainwater was testing positive for glyphosate.
Right.
So,
I remember in a study that said that. And I actually gathered rainwater at MIT and I sent it off to Anthony and he found glyphosate in it in
wow.
Cambridge, Massachusetts.
And even
So it is in the rain.
yeah, the umbilical cords of our babies. Like it's like, do they not understand? How could you not understand the impact that this is having on our children and on us? But I think it's just a slower process. And of course, if there is a prescription to treat the conditions that are being brought on by that, it makes it double profitable. And I think that's fair enough
That's
to
so
say.
true. And you look at, I know, Wegovy and the enormous attraction today of this drug that is an injection that can help you lose weight. That's very interesting to me. And if so many people are taking on this drug and it costs $1,000 a month and the government's trying to make it be something you can, that is supported by welfare and that sort of thing. I mean, it's just like, how are we going to be able to pay for that, right?
Yeah.
For
It's
one thing. And then, of course, also those drugs can be very toxic. People can end up with a paralyzed gut and
yeah.
irreversible from those drugs. And so it's
When
really frightening to me that that's happening.
Yeah, the gastroparesis, like just the onset of that, and then also working often with people who've had that effect from those, and they're just, and I often think about the GLP-1 receptors being throughout the body, not just hepatic, like we're dealing with brain. You've got these receptors all over the body, and
That's
I
right.
think if we think that we can take a complex problem and we have this one solution,
Yeah.
it's not going to, I mean, it's not going to happen that way. We're too complex as humans for it to be that easy, I
Absolutely.
think.
And in fact, I think our own cells are supposed to make the GLP-1 and they're not making enough. So why aren't they making enough? And that's because things are disrupted and the system is actually really smart to know we need the fat in order to stay healthy because of the disruption of the metabolism. So there's a whole biological mechanism involved. And if you sort of force the system and say, okay, here's your GLP-1, I know you didn't make it, but here it is anyway, that's going to confuse the cells and make them make the wrong decision about your health, I think, and actually cause other problems down the road that can be more serious than being obese, you know? So it's really a matter of, and in fact, GLP-1, there's a microbe. I was just reading about this recently. I got very interested in the GLP-1 receptors and those analogs. That there's a microbe called Akkermansia.
Yes.
Akkermansia mucinophilia. I'm not sure how to say that. Mucinophilia.
I can do the first part. I don't think I can.
Meaning that they love mucin, and mucin is what's made by the gut and lines the gut wall and keeps it healthy. And actually, the Akkermansia, that's the only thing they eat is these mucins that the gut microbes that the colonocytes make. And then, and it turns out that if you have a healthy amount of Akkermansia, your mucins are actually healthier. So it's really quite bizarre because they're eating it, but actually it results in the production of butyrate, which the colonocytes love. And so there's a whole feedback loop where the whole system is working well. They get enough butyrate, they make enough mucins, the mucins get eaten. The whole thing is working really well when everything's good. But then because glyphosate's messing up the whole system, the Akkermansia become low, and then the mucin actually becomes weak, and then you get the infiltration of the pathogens that causes a leaky gut, and all of that. So you get a big mess out of it, but you don't have enough GLP-1 because that Akkermansia produces a product that stimulates the release of GLP-1.
Yeah, and I've actually
it's all a big system.
Yeah, I've used that in office, and I've used it personally just because of the benefits of it, and of course isolating that. And I think so much of the hormonal disruption, so many of those that are happening, I don't know that we'll ever uncover it all, Stephanie. You might, but
it's really hard. It's such a huge space. I love it. And like I said, I like puzzles. I told you earlier, I like puzzles, and this is a fantastic puzzle, and every time I get a new paper that looks like it's got some interesting insights, I can't wait to read it. I get so excited. So it's been great with my job. I love my work. To get paid to be able to read these really interesting articles and try to figure out the puzzle, so it's just really, really great.
And taking that information that is so complex and breaking it down so that I can understand it, or whoever is like, I think that empowerment is what we have to help people understand, that just because something is widely distributed does not mean that it is safe. And the generally recognized as safe list of things, I mean, there's so much to question on that whole thing because it's not cumulative. I mean, all of those, even that list of what we consider safe, well, something in a small amount, your body could probably detox, but in other amounts, you're dealing with a whole different conversation. And I think, it's beautiful, the feedback loop of Akkermansia and how it's going to be able to do a complete cycle. But when we put things in and we prop it up and say, here, take a GLP-1, there are cofactors involved in that process. You're dealing with the price tag of dumping something into the body and then the body trying to desperately place it in a category when it really doesn't belong there. And of course, I think that's how we disrupt like singular supplementation of vitamin D or things that do not have those accompanying cofactors. We're creating
I totally agree with you. Yeah, I love vitamin D, but I don't think people should take it as a supplement. Just get out in the sunlight, and you can eat foods that contain vitamin D because they'll contain all the other things there that are appropriate to be with the vitamin D. But to take it in isolation is not a good idea, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I've moved away from that. In the natural health world, you have these like set protocols and all of these different, like, this is one thing, we're going to take one thing and fix the whole system. And it's like, it doesn't work in allopathic medicine. It certainly doesn't work in naturopathic because again, we are too fearfully and wonderfully made for that to be, to be possible, and I think because of that, the intelligence of our body with glyphosate, I believe it's flagging food triggers, all kinds of things, because it's our bodies are trying to tell us a story. This is not possible to break down. And I think the MTHFR, like the specific methylation gene SNPs, COMT, and even VDR and some of these others, all being magnesium dependent, folate dependent,
Mm-hmm.
and then having glyphosate come in. These detox pathways for 40% of the tested population have some sort of methylation errors in the liver. I mean, it's humanity, but it's that kind of thing that actually allows that glyphosate or any toxic chemical to build up in the liver as the body struggles to have all of these cofactors to get it out of the system. And that was something for my husband that's been an ongoing process is how do you detox glyphosate? It stores in the bone and tissue of mammals. And, I think, can you talk a little bit, Stephanie, about how are we getting exposed to glyphosate in general? What kind of things are we going to need to watch other than just, of course, eating organically?
Right. Well, so there's a lot of different foods that are contaminated with glyphosate. Zen Honeycutt, who's a friend of mine, she's the founder of Moms Across America. And she's done a number of tests on different categories of food. She tested school lunches. So she has her Moms Across America, and she gets them to get samples of food from the kids' schools and send them off to get glyphosate testing. And she found like something like 93% of, and maybe 96% were contaminated with glyphosate or AMPA, which is a breakdown product of glyphosate. She tested at fast food restaurants, and 100% of the samples were contaminated with glyphosate. So it's not like it's just occasionally in your food. It's like all over the food supply. The government hasn't bothered to test it because they know it's all over the food supply. They don't care because they say it's safe. So we don't care, it's fine. It's in the food. Don't worry about it. That's the message the government gives us. But we should be worried about it. And I think the most important thing you can do is to go organic. And that's something we've done ever since I first discovered glyphosate. We did a big purge. We threw away all the spices, all the foods, all the cereals, and started over and bought everything certified organic in 2012. And we've been eating certified organic ever since then. So I think it's essential to do that one thing, to get rid of that of the toxic food. And you're not eliminating glyphosate altogether when you go certified organic, because it does show up usually at much lower levels. It shows up in organic foods, not because they're necessarily cheating, which we would certainly hope they're not cheating, but it's more because it's in the rain, it's in the manure, so they really can't avoid it. You still get glyphosate in the organic foods.
Yeah, and I think it was, is it a 32-year half-life in the soil when glyphosate, that was some research that I had done about fallow ground needing a farm that may be wanting to grow organically. There needs to be at least 7 years of fallow ground. But now I think about that with glyphosate and I'm like, it's probably much longer than that because the whole.
It depends, but there was a study in Canada. They looked at trees that had been sprayed with glyphosate over a decade before that time. And they got the tissues out of the trees and they found glyphosate there, still there after all those years. Wow. So sometimes it just sticks around forever. And it gets into traps in certain kinds of soils. It gets into trapped areas where the microbes can't get at it, because if you've got the right microbes in the soil, they can break it down. But there aren't many microbes that can break it down either. So they're actually doing some kind of soil, rejuvenation by giving them basically probiotics, just like they do for the gut. Wow. Probiotics for the soil to help. If you can get microbes growing in the soil that can break it down, that's kind of your best bet to get rid of it, Yeah. But it's very difficult to get rid of. And of course, you can chelate it out too. There's sort of binders, So right. People are recommending taking certain binders like fulvic acid and humic acid, bentonite clay. These things can grab a hold of the glyphosate and pass it out through the feces. So that's one way to kind of get it out of your gut. But getting it out of those proteins, like those collagen molecules, good luck with that, right? It's just like it's really hard to get it out.
Do you feel like infrared sauna or anything that might help like detox with it, like transdermally? Do you think that is something
I think that's possible, that you can be excreting it through your sweat, okay. And also because you pee it out, right? Because you can sample it in your urine. Yeah. And I'm sure a lot of it does go out through the feces even normally, So most of it actually comes in and goes out, but there's a certain small percentage that ends up in the proteins and sticks around forever. And that accumulates, of course.
It really makes you think about the sourcing of like so many people for health reasons do collagen powders and collagen
I
protein and
know.
that important structure. But I know like having a grass fed, grass finished organic, you're like, yes, that's probably feasible. But it really makes you think when you started explaining about the collagen and the protein disruption. And I was like, yeah, I mean, which I've always talked to clients about. It's very important that you don't just get a cheap collagen because you're literally
Yes.
concentrating.
Organic collagen. It's probably kind of hard to find, but that would be the thing you would
Yeah.
want to do. Grass fed, like you said, grass fed
Yeah.
collagen.
Have you your opinion on like the chelation of key minerals, Stephanie, as far as copper and let's say magnesium, are you finding in your research that there's certain ones that are key to energy production and innate immune response, like magnesium for MAG ATP? Are you seeing any correlation to like that, the breakdown of or chelation of magnesium with glyphosate and like a heavier load than like it does copper, or what have you found, or do you feel like it's all minerals that it would
I
actually
think
just
it's at least magnesium, copper, zinc, iron, and manganese. At least those. They're all affected. They all bind very strongly to glyphosate, and I think glyphosate is messing up the whole balance in the body of these minerals. These minerals are both toxic and deficient at the same time because of glyphosate, because it just totally messes up the system that normally would handle them. Anthony and I wrote a paper about manganese, which was quite interesting,
oh,
because manganese actually, glyphosate binds very strongly to manganese and keeps it away from the lactobacillus, which actually depend critically on manganese to be healthy. So that's part of how it kills the lactobacillus. But the manganese then, normally the liver hooks manganese onto bile acids and ships them back to the gut. And then they're eventually picked up by the chylomicron and they're distributed over the whole body into the blood. So they have this whole circulation system that depends upon careful ways to transport the manganese and deliver it to where it needs to be to do its work, and then keeping it out of critical places. But what happens is that manganese concentrates in the liver, and then the liver actually sends with glyphosate. It ends up sort of dumping the manganese in the liver. The liver, instead of going because it messes up the bile acids, and so manganese accumulates in the liver, and then the manganese actually travels very well along nerve fibers, and so the manganese goes up the vagus nerve, for example, travels up the nerves, gets up to the brain centers in the center of the brain,
wow.
things like the substantia nigra, where you have Parkinson's disease. So the manganese can actually cause a Parkinson's-like symptom, and Parkinson's is associated to manganese toxicity in those brain centers in the center of the brain. And so I think the manganese ends up transporting along nerve fibers instead of being distributed throughout the body. So now you've got manganese deficiency everywhere, except you've got manganese toxicity in the brain that can
Wow.
cause things like Parkinson's. And I think glyphosate is a causal. Papers have shown that farmers that work with glyphosate have an increased risk to Parkinson's disease.
And I have a client that actually had been diagnosed with ALS, and or that was, it wasn't definitive, but that seemed to be everything. And as we did testing, that was what I kept finding was manganese toxicity can actually
Mm.
mimic those symptoms. And so that led us to a hair mineral analysis test, a heavy metal test, and just amazed at how those like key minerals like of course, deficient in that, excretion profile, but definitely the fact that it was all in the wrong place, which I think is,
Exactly.
it's just a testament of how we can't do that to ourselves. We can't substitute one thing in and think, oh, that's not going to mess up everything. The body doesn't have one mechanism that operates in a vacuum. It never will, so that's
Yeah.
why this one thing can do so much damage. And I've been amazed at the amount of people I work with hormone imbalance, and just the fact that we have gone through the progressions and the seasons of change as women and even men. And I'm running hormone profiles, seeing that they are so dysregulated beyond stage and season of life. And I think it has to be that the whole metabolic pathway has been disrupted. And then when you talk about glycine and amino acid profile, and of course, how important that is for serotonin to then, progesterone to be able to produce serotonin. And it has to affect all of that because it just seems like we have an unprecedented need for younger and younger women to do hormone replacement because we don't run on hormones, we run on the minerals that signal our hormones. So if in the background we have glyphosate dismantling our mineral profile at a rate, I mean, 1 billion times faster, that blows my mind. Like,
That is amazing, isn't it? Yeah.
yeah, it's
It's an
like,
incredible chelator.
how are
Yeah,
we,
and that was a lot of
we
what Don
still,
Huber talked about in that first talk that I heard about the
yeah,
minerals and how much they're messed up. And he showed it for his own studies in the plants. And sulfur was another thing that was way low in the plants that were exposed to glyphosate.
wow.
And it
So
messes up nitrogen fixation. So, I mean, just so you get nitrate fertilizers, you have to use a lot more fertilizers of nitrate because it comes up inefficiently into the plant because the microbes that fixate the nitrate are broken by glyphosate. So then the nitrogen fertilizer washes off when you get the rain. Now you get high nitrogen levels in the waterways, and then you get this overgrowth of all these algae that then cause all kinds of trouble, including global climate change, because the nitrogen oxides escape into the air, and they're much, much worse than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas.
Well, and you think about just as far as like just that disruption alone and how we're not regeneratively growing our food. Like we expect the soil to just have an endless bank
Right.
account of minerals, and yet now we've added something to the mix that makes unhealthy plants that can produce fruit, and yet they look like an apple. They taste like, you just think it's an apple, right? And it's in minerally, the latest studies I had seen a few years ago was 5 apples today to it just be equivalent to 1 apple in a mineral profile 50 years ago. And
That's
when
so
you think,
scary, isn't it? Because you just can't even get enough minerals from your food anymore. Then you
no,
sort of
and
have to take supplements, and that's,
yeah,
I would hope the food would, I always think food is medicine, and just eat good food
right.
and you'll be okay. But may not be true today because the food is so deficient.
Yeah, and I have that conversation a lot where people say, I really just want to get all my nutrients from my food. And I'm like, absolutely. It's just, I don't think calorically we could eat the amount of food to get the mineral equivalency. And then never mind the fact that what we have in it, if it's sprayed with glyphosate, that's being dismantled even more. So it's kind of like, okay, where do we start? Because we have to have a starting place. And so for us, it's been to choose organically. Now, I have researched that depending on the sources, there's 26 to 32 class 1 chemicals that can be sprayed on an organic crop, but there's like 232 that can be sprayed, and glyphosate is in that profile for conventional produce. So for me, it's like, no, it's not perfect, but it's definitely better than knowing that it's coming in. But something that I had found was that with non-GMO crops, I think there's this false security that, oh, okay, those are non-GMO. And often we equate non-GMO with organic. It's totally not the same thing
No.
because I did find that they could desiccate the fields of grain in dry, especially in wet years with glyphosate. I mean, a huge amount sprayed. I also had read that, and I don't know if I can reference that, but this was years ago, that they have to actually leave the fields and not be in there because they've sprayed so much. It's for like 2 weeks. And I thought, and this is our, that's what we were eating, that it was certified chemical free of residue after a certain time, but we weren't eating one kernel of wheat.
I see.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
so for me, it's like we definitely need to demand better food because
Right.
this whole system is propped up on toothpicks. I mean,
I
we're
know. That's
it's
true.
kind of it's kind of like, where do we start? And the only, when I was researching for my husband, until I found you, Stephanie, I didn't know about Don Hubert at the time, but I was really lost as to how do we get this out of the system. And the only studies that I could find were through veterinarian research, where they had used that for cattle that they had been feeding GMO feed and they couldn't reproduce. And so, of course, that meant money. And so some studies were done in the veterinarian line, and they use sauerkraut.
Right. Yes,
In
that's
that.
a paper that I like to reference. Really, really cool. Sauerkraut juice. And
Yeah.
also bentonite clay and fulvic acid and humic acid sauerkraut juice. That was the formula that they
Yeah.
did. And they actually tested the cows for glyphosate before and after, and the levels went down in the urine. And the cows were sick, and then their health improved.
Yeah.
So
And
that
I
it
think
was kind of
even became fertile again because I think they were able to kind of switch that over. And so binders and all, we do use some when we're trying to remove that, but I'm careful with binders because we already have such a mineral deficiency that it's,
right.
not
That's the problem.
selective. And so
Yeah.
I think it's a little bit difficult. And do you think that, so as far as the chelation of magnesium and copper, just those two missing minerals in the nucleus, like how important they
The
are.
mitochondria, are so critical on those minerals. So
Yeah,
it's really
there's
problematic. And glyphosate definitely messes up the mitochondria. They've shown that in multiple studies, causing the oxidative stress and damaging the mitochondria. And that's a path to cancer, because once you get those DNA mutations in the mitochondria, you end up with cancer.
Yeah. And I think that it's just heartbreaking when you think about like our children having genetic SNPs that prevent toxic, detoxing chemicals through the liver. And now we've added something at a rate that even 100% function is going to challenge at best. And then the very mineral in the mitochondria, I mean, there are 50,000 atoms of copper in one
Mm.
mitochondria. That
That
just
is
like,
amazing. That
yeah.
is so amazing. Is that the numbers in biology are so mind-boggling, and just
Oh,
the number of mitochondria that there are in the cell as well. There's thousands of them.
yeah. I
It's
think those
amazing.
little pictures that we did like early on in school was like a cell with like three mitochondria. And
I
I'm like,
know.
wow, how far we, because
Yeah,
there's
you
like
totally get the wrong
quadrillions.
idea.
Yeah, I just was
It's
amazed.
it's
But
incredible, and
oh,
atoms of a mineral.
yeah.
The numbers are mind-boggling.
Yeah, it's I think one thing as far as and I cannot forgive her, it may be Don Hubert. He had a statement that he made. I think it was him, or I'm misquoting someone else, but he actually shared about the legacy that we would leave our children. And he said they wouldn't marvel at, of course, I'm going to butcher it, but they wouldn't marvel at all of our, all the things that we've invented and all that, but they would ask the question, why were we willing to sacrifice our children?
Yes,
And I
that
think
is a
in
quote
your,
from him.
yeah, it's that was so powerful to me in that I was like, that to understand the level of this, that people are resilient, but we're getting, epigenetically, we're not, I don't even know what is this doing to, if a mother passes her mineral load to her child in pregnancy, and yet her minerals are so depleted. Is it any
Right,
wonder that she has a son or a daughter that's autistic? Because they started life with a deficit in the bank account for minerals, and now we're going
right.
to feed them in the school system all the foods that are just going to be toxic that aren't really food at all.
Yeah, there's some studies on rats or mice, I think it was, that they exposed pregnant mice to low dose glyphosate, and then they tracked the future generations, and the mice seemed to be fine, and the offspring seemed to be fine. And then when they grew up and they had pups, there started to be some problems. And then when they grew up and they had pups, there were more problems. So they started to see a lot of issues showing up in the later generations as a consequence of the exposure to the great grandmother during pregnancy. I found that really mind boggling. It's
That's
this epigenetic effect that passes through multiple generations and survives for several generations and gets worse over time. So now we're sitting in humans, we're already in the grandchildren generation because glyphosate's been around since 1974.
mm.
So
And
now
was
we've
it
got kids whose, grandmother was exposed. It's
Yeah.
really scary.
And kind of how do you think that it's playing a key role in the methylation gene SNPs or
I
in just
do.
in that just because it is changing? I mean, it's changing
Right.
everything
I
about.
even think I know how it's doing that. I've written about it actually, because glyphosate actually suppresses dehydrogenases as a class. There's a whole bunch of different dehydrogenases. They're really important enzymes that take hydrogen off of carbon molecule, carbon chains. They
Mhm.
extract hydrogen. And the dehydrogenases are an essential part of the process by which those methyl groups are made. And the methyl groups become formate, and then formate becomes the methyl that's attached to methylene tetrahydrofolate, and then it
Wow.
becomes methionine, and that whole process, even the methionine synthesis, the enzyme that synthesizes methionine, is suppressed in E. coli exposed to glyphosate. So the whole system that makes the methyl that ends up being passed around in those methyl pathways is disrupted. So I think you get a deficiency in those methyls because of glyphosate.
And those being so, methyl tetrahydrofolate reductase being magnesium dependent and
Yeah, there you
the
go.
role that copper plays. And I'm like, I think we just need to stand in awe sometimes at the fact that any of us are still here and okay.
It's amazing that we do as well as we do, right?
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
a yeah.
it's really incredible. All the different ways in which glyphosate messes things up is just an incredible story.
So, do you have any information on how this would disrupt ceruloplasmin? So, if we're
I do.
affecting magnesium, and I'm assuming retinol eventually, and some of those key trilogy there that work inside the mitochondria, and in the gut, like we're talking about this going how it has gut disruptions and how important it is that we have certain probiotics in the gut that can actually break down into hydrogen atoms and so that we can do that. But I would love to hear about that a little bit, and is bringing hydrogen water in and those kind of things as helpful for that kind of hijacking a system, since we are having to biohack some of this. Or
Well, first of all, I'll give you two answers. One is ceruloplasmin, and one is hydrogen gas, because they're both really interesting. But ceruloplasmin, as you know, it's a major copper carrier in the body, and it has several different copper binding sites. And every one of those copper binding sites has at least one highly conserved glycine residue. So I suspect that glyphosate is going in there in place of glycine and disrupting its ability to bind copper,
my
which is
goodness.
then causing copper to become toxic because it's not being properly transported.
So would that be why we would often see on red blood cell copper testing in a blood serum panel that it is actually not attached to the protein, probably glycine, and so it isn't able to go into and be bound in ceruloplasmin? Because I know in cancer, I work with a lot of clients who have cancer, and one thing that we look at is copper status, not because copper is bad, but when copper goes out into the serum, it's usually because it can't bind to a protein. And I'm wondering,
Exactly. There's free copper, which is toxic. Copper is really, and copper reacts with iron. The Benton reaction is a really big mess. And so,
right?
especially with some, reactive oxygen, copper and iron together can really do damage. It's just so reactive.
Yeah.
And but normally the copper gets bound to the ceruloplasmin. That's how it gets transported. Most of the copper is bound to ceruloplasmin. But if the ceruloplasmin is not functional, then the copper becomes free, and then the free copper becomes toxic. And so we have both copper toxicity and copper deficiency at the same time, because the
Yeah.
whole mechanism that the body uses to get to the copper, you have to deliver the copper to where it's needed. You have to do so safely.
Mhm.
And that's tricky. And you've got glyphosate messing that whole system up. So that's a huge problem. And then the hydrogen is really interesting. And I don't know if you are aware that I've been talking about deuterium lately. Do you know anything about deuterium?
I saw that on your page when I was pulling up bio stuff, and I thought, oh, I've got it written up at the top of my page. I can't end this without talking about deuterium because
That's my latest passion. It's so fun. I really love it. And I really think we're onto something big. I'm having a great time with my collaborators. I've got some really smart people that I'm working with. And I think we're figuring things out. Again, it goes back to the gut microbes, and it goes back to the butyrate, because the butyrate that the colonocytes love so much is a low deuterium nutrient. It has low deuterium. Deuterium is heavy hydrogen.
Right.
It has an extra neutron, so it's twice as heavy. It's a natural element. It's like carbon-14, it's a natural element, but it has an extra neutron as well as the proton. And it's present in seawater at 155 parts per million. So that sounds small, but there's actually lots of deuterium in your body. It's like 5 or 6 times as much deuterium as there is calcium in the blood, just to give you a perspective. So it's a common element, and it messes up the mitochondrial ATPase pumps. So the mitochondria, the whole cell has come up with a very sophisticated mechanism that involves a lot of different proteins to keep the deuterium out of the mitochondria. And one of the ways that it does that is through distillation. So actually the gut microbes make hydrogen gas. They pull protons, for example, dehydrogenases, they take hydrogens off of proteins, but you have hydrogenases, which make hydrogen gas by yanking hydrogen off of organic molecules. They make hydrogen gas. And when they do that, they lose most of the deuterium. The deuterium stays behind. And the hydrogen gas that they make is 80% depleted in deuterium compared to the normal amount in water. That is huge. So they make the hydrogen gas that's low in deuterium, and then they use that hydrogen gas as a reducing agent. And that's how they can make the methyls, for example. So I think the methyls are low in deuterium that are in the methylation pathway. And acetate, which is the acetogenic bacteria, make acetate using hydrogen gas. So that acetate is low in deuterium, and then the acetate becomes butyrate, and the butyrate is low in deuterium. So there's a whole system in the gut of processing sugars and formate, some simple organic molecules, complex organic molecules, like all the fiber gets broken down into simple organic molecules, and then it gets converted to these short chain fatty acids via this process that involves hydrogen gas. So every time you convert it through hydrogen gas, you get a low deuterium nutrient, and then you feed that to the colonocytes. So the colonocytes stay healthy because they're getting low deuterium in their mitochondria through that process. It's really fascinating. And then glyphosate disrupts those enzymes.
Sorry, Stephanie. I think we have a frozen moment there. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. You look fine.
Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry. I think I had an internet glitch. So yes, it says it's unstable, but it fixed itself. So hopefully it's going to be okay. Okay, sorry. Go ahead. I apologize.
Yeah, basically, the whole system of making hydrogen, from which you eventually
Wow.
which butyrate, which is low in deuterium. So that whole system of making those gases and then turning them back into water is absolutely essential in the gut. Those low deuterium nutrients to the colonocytes to keep.
Oh no.
Did it happen again?
Yes, I'm sorry. I don't know what's happening.
It's wanting us to quit. It's
no.
saying we've had enough.
So I think I'm good now. I'm so sorry about that. But it actually I could hear you. It was just freezing. So I hope that comes through for everyone. But so deuterium, so heavy water, which is how I've always kind of thought about that and heard it explained with deuterium.
Yes.
The foods that we eat, so you said water contains deuterium, and there's different types of water that would have lower levels of deuterium. And I know they do make deuterium depleted water.
Yes.
Are you familiar with George Wiseman and his AquaCure machine? Have you ever that actually makes hydrogen, like he has it through an inhalation system?
Oh wow, yeah.
Yeah, he actually, the AquaCure machine it's right up your alley. He's an engineer, so he developed that years ago for actually carburation and actually, I guess, converting for fuel mileage improvement. And so it actually ended up becoming something that people used from, breathing the hydrogen gas off of that was actually very beneficial for health. So
interesting. Yeah, I've wondered how much the hydrogen gas that's made non-biologically, whether it has the same amount of depletion or not, I don't know. Right. Because the enzymes are able to deplete, but also deuterium naturally stays in the more solid state. So there's going to be a natural process of depletion even without the enzymes' help. but the enzyme might be able to make it even more depleted than what it would be through a chemical reaction.
Right.
But I'm pretty sure that hydrogen gas would also be depleted in deuterium. And the foods have different amounts. So the fats generally have the lowest. As a rule of thumb, the sugars and the carbohydrates have the most deuterium. The proteins have less, and the fats have the least. So when you eat a high-fat diet, you're eating a low deuterium diet.
Yeah. And it makes you think of how people feel better when they cut out those processed foods and all these things. And then you think about, well, why, biochemistry wise, would that matter? I think it's the deuterium and the fact that we need some, but we do not need near the amount that we have. And just the breakdown in the cell. And I think the Krebs cycle, the ability to make energy, the mitochondrial function is kind of bogged down with deuterium.
Absolutely. That's exactly what
Yeah.
happens. The pumps die. They get killed by the deuterium. And they also spew out reactive oxygen, which is very damaging to the cell.
Yeah.
So a lot of issues for the cellular health has to do with reactive oxygen, and much of it is produced by sick mitochondria that aren't functioning well. And I think deuterium is a major player in causing the mitochondria to be sick.
Wow. So other than trying to support low deuterium foods like our water sources, I know there are some like spring waters that have a little bit of a lower deuterium level. And then I think, is it Robert Slovak that has the light water, which he's actually developed. I think it's very expensive to produce.
This is light water here.
Okay.
I drink a cup of it. I drink a third of a cup and 2/3 a cup of regular water, which I mix together every day. Wow. So I've been buying light water for a long time, and it's super expensive. It's like you can't believe you're buying water that costs as much as wine, but that's what you're doing, you know. And I've decided that it's worth it. So for me.
Well, and I think too, just, for the audience to be able to lower your deuterium levels, which you can test your deuterium levels. It takes a specific lab to do that, but being able, and I think even with light water, they do offer that just so that it's very helpful with people who have autoimmune or like are just not able to recover energy well. I think to get that baseline and say, okay, how much of this excess do you have because of everything, and actually try to dose accordingly to get that up. And I have used it with cancer patients on a 3-month regimen, a pretty high amount of that diluted like in a liter of water daily to help healing. I mean, because we know that people who have cancer have very high deuterium levels. And so it seems like anytime you're looking at chronic illness, there's that whole mechanism at work of where the mitochondria are dying because they do not have what they need. And then you're getting this deuterium buildup. I think it's exciting to think that actually George Wiseman, who I mentioned with the AquaCure, I interviewed him a few months back, and in my opinion, he's a genius. He's an inventor with a mind he's obsessed with hydrogen and plasma. And he's just like, it's amazing to listen to him just have an interview too. But he actually has a prototype for an addition to his machine that he has actually used last year, and he's been sending it into the lab, and it's actually not deuterium depleted water, it's actually deuterium deleted water. He's been able to produce a deuterium free water, which he says that he's trying to get that so that it could actually be added on, which just took years and years of his own. He said he has to work the bugs out of it a little bit, but that was exciting.
That is exciting.
Yeah, if you could actually, it would be the first ever, because the process of making deuterium is it's explosive. Deuterium.
Yeah, there isn't an easy way to make the deuterium depleted water.
Yeah,
I think at the moment it's mostly coming from Russia.
Yeah. And I've heard that Antarctica has the lowest deuterium levels.
Yes, that's right. I think like 89 parts per million as compared to 155 in seawater.
In context, that's like health, like you're talking about a health tonic from beyond. And I'm like, why aren't we taking truckloads of
I know. Water from Antarctica. There is glacier water available on the web, and I suspect it's low in deuterium. Yeah, they sell it.
Yeah. Well, some of the most healthy populations that they had studied, I think in the Russian studies, were actually places that had glacier water. It was very, very low in deuterium. And the people were able to, reproduce much older later in life, and they just had an extension of life that and I think that, but if you look at the gut health profile and what's being done to us with glyphosate, you start to see this whole connection of like the gut biome and hydrogen availability and the bacteria to break down hydrogen to make these available, just so many things that we need. And then how that affects deuterium. And it's mind-boggling, but it's also exciting because I think deuterium may actually come closer to being a solution than most anything that we're doing. Do you think that's fair to
I'm
say
very
that?
excited about deuterium. And that's really been
Yeah.
my big thing, right? Ever since December 2019, when I first became aware. Laszlo Boros was my mentor. I mean, basically, he sent me a note and congratulated me on a paper that Greg Nye and I had written. And then he said, "Oh, by the way, deuterium." And I didn't know anything about deuterium, so I that perked me up. And then once I started looking, I immediately saw the connection to glyphosate because the enzymes that keep deuterium healthy in our body are affected badly by glyphosate. And so I think it's another way in which glyphosate is messing things up, and that's what's causing the mitochondrial damage, which is then causing all the other problems. So I think all disease begins in the gut, and all disease begins with mitochondrial dysfunction, and you get both of those together with the deuterium, it's all there. And I
Yeah.
think it's going to be a breakthrough. I'm hoping that we'll get more people interested. We need more studies because there's a lot of things that are kind of conjectural at this point. We just don't have the information.
I feel like if they would allow for the testing we can do ceruloplasmin in a serum panel and kind of see where it's at in placing. But if there were ways to connect studies to deuterium levels based on ceruloplasmin and how is that affecting how the cell actually produces, and binds to ceruloplasmin. It's a whole, I mean, I think it'll be a different way to biohack, honestly, to be able to handle a lot of these factors because we're not facing what our grandmothers faced, and so I
Right.
think we have to have just thinking about magnesium and mag ATP, the ability to have magnesium be dependent, in the cell for energy and the fact that it's being pulled out. It's almost as if we have two steps forward and one step back. But of course, trying to find ways that we can have good supplementation for at least the mineral profile, and eating as well as we can, but knowing that we don't live in a perfect world. So, it
Right. We live in a very imperfect world,
yeah,
but there's hope. I'm really excited about the new administration and RFK Jr. and all of that. So I think there's going to be
yes,
some change.
I
There's
think
at
so.
least now an awareness that the country is sick and we need to fix that.
And that we've got to
And
look where all the money, where follow the money, as the saying goes. It's like, I
yes.
think, I have been amazed, Stephanie, at the number of clients that I will have anything from respiratory illness they can't recover from all the way to cancer. And we use Mosaic Laboratories to run glyphosate panels. And I think it's a shock to most people to
Mm,
find that, we now have a quantitative amount that's acceptable to have in our system. And now the measurements above that are just, I mean, the exposure is very real. And being
hmm.
able to correlate that and of course help people get that out of the system as best they can. I think removing the source is as much as possible is the first step, but
Right.
definitely adding in diatomaceous earth and some soft binders and things like that can be helpful. But
Hmm.
I
And
hope,
possibly some probiotics. There might be some microbes that can break down glyphosate in probiotics, such as Acetobacter. I have hope that that
yeah,
could be the case,
right,
which would be
right.
great.
Yeah, and being able to get this whole gut mess situated because that I think is where all of our problems come from. We don't, people talk about the gut brain connection. I'm like, I'm pretty sure they're one.
Yeah.
I think the connection is definitely proven, but how important those beneficial bacteria and fungi and all of these things and I think that's what's led them to have to to spray fungicide now, and so many
I
different.
know that's true. I mean, in fact, Don Huber has done research with the farmers in Florida with the citrus fruits, the oranges. They have that citrus greening, which is a fungus infection, and he's shown them that if you just convert to organic, that problem goes away.
Yeah, well, because the weakened plants are what, the pathogens are you're most susceptible to the pathogens. And that's where, for me, they're creating a whole problem that's going to require more and more chemicals to be put on our food if they don't back it up and say, we've got to start all over again. And I think you and I buying organically and having a food revolution where people start really not paying for stuff that is just not food. And I
Yes, I
do
think
think,
that's going to hurt the industry enough that they're going to start to think about maybe producing something different, right? If they can't
yeah,
sell it, they
and
won't
at
produce
least,
it. So we need
yeah,
to get the entire population on board with buying certified organic whole foods, stay away from the processed foods.
yeah.
We can do this grassroots bottom up, you know.
Yeah, and I think just a do-over. Sometimes we get those opportunities in life, but at least for our children to say, let's not hand this genetic mess to them where we're having all these problems. We can, begin to change that. And I think the administration is trying to make it's a huge undertaking. But
Yes, with
you
a
have,
lot of opposition from the
yeah,
industries.
yeah,
So
because you're
it's
gonna
a challenge.
the pushback on economically, like, the money that you follow. And I think it's interesting to see that, the producers of glyphosate do not seem to care. They have deep pockets. So I think that, a lawsuit here and, it's kind of meaningless to them. But for like my husband, which we didn't, pursue anything like that. But when it's your life and it's affected your husband with leukemia, or if it's affected your child with autism, then it's personal. And I think that
Hmm.
that's what has to be, is where we stand up for our families and say, we're not buying this stuff anymore. Like, we're not going to continue to support this problem. And that's hard though, because we like our comforts. People are resistant to accept that something could be as bad as it is. But I
Hmm.
think glyphosate is probably far worse than we even know, even with all of the research. And so we need you to keep doing that for great minds
Yes.
that can make sense of all of that and pass it on in a way that we are like, I get that. I see how I'm going to need to change that. So are there any, I know your book, and I'm going to include this in the show notes, and we'll also have links for that on YouTube and all the places. But your book is The Toxic Legacy: How the Weed Killer Glyphosate is Destroying Your Health and Environment. So they can get that on your site, but I'm sure also on Amazon. I think I saw it there. So it's widely available. Is that
Yes,
correct?
it's available on several booksellers
Yeah.
websites. And
Yeah.
my website is stephanieseneff.net.
Okay. All right. Do you have any closing thoughts or goodbyes, Stephanie, or did you think we covered it?
We did a good job. It was great. I really appreciate it. And I always say, get out in the sunlight, walk the beach, just get out in nature, stay
Yeah.
healthy.
I think nature can heal way more than we damage at times if we just give it an opportunity, for sure.
That's right.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening. If this podcast inspired you or encouraged you in some way, please leave us a review or share this episode with a friend. If you need help connecting the dots of your own health journey, I would love to help you with that. You can reach me via the link below to set up a one-on-one consultation. You can also connect with us by joining our free Facebook community, which is linked below, or at healthywithhappyspurling.com. Until next time.